Case Studies on Environmental Management Policies. REDD+. About 11% of human-caused greenhouse gases comes from the destruction of tropical forests. REDD+ is a system being designed by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to reduce these emissions. REDD+ is the abbreviation of Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, plus the role of conservation, sustainable management of forests, and the enhancement of forest carbon stocks. Under REDD+, countries and landholders that protect and restore forests are rewarded by developed countries. For example, a community could receive REDD+ funding or training to improve yields from existing farmland, in return for avoiding the clearing of standing forests. In this lecture, we're going to find out what the concept of REDD+ is and to analyze some REDD+ cases. 1. The concept of REDD+. First, let's begin with the concept of REDD+. Traditional approaches to managing tropical forests have not been very successful. Given that countries wish to keep most of their standing forests, it is clear that on balance, the drivers of deforestation are far more powerful than the policies and initiatives to conserve them. REDD+ emerged as a new and innovative approach to shift the balance away from forest destruction in favor of the wise stewardship of forests. REDD stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, while the plus refers to the role of conservation, sustainable management of forests, and enhancement of forest carbon stocks in developing countries. The aim of REDD+ is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from forests and increase the removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere by forests in developing countries. The aim of REDD+ is thus quite clearly to mitigate climate change. To understand this aim, we need to understand that REDD+ was developed as an instrument of the UNFCCC. Therefore, REDD+ is a vehicle to encourage developing countries to reduce emissions and enhance the removal of greenhouse gases through forest management and conservation. The development of REDD+ under the UNFCCC began in 2005 when the 11th Conference of Parties to the UNFCCC agreed to include the concept of policy approaches and positive incentives for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation and forest degradation on its agenda. Deforestation refers to the complete clearance of forest, whereas degradation refers to a reduction in forest vegetation, but not the complete removal of vegetation, which can occur, for example, when companies are not careful when they selectively harvest large logs in the forest, or when local communities remove large amounts of fuel wood for their own use or local sale. 2 years later, at the 13th UNFCCC COP in Bali in 2007, REDD+ was born. In what is known as the Bali Action Plan, the 13th COP stated that a comprehensive approach to mitigating global climate change should include policy approaches and positive incentives on issues related to reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries, and the role of conservation, sustainable management of forests, and enhancement of forest carbon stocks in developing countries. The 5 types of activities recognized as comprising REDD+ are thus activities in developing countries that reduce emissions from deforestation, reduce emissions from degradation, promote forest conservation, promote sustainable management of forests, and enhance forest carbon stocks. 9 years later, in 2016, the Paris Climate Change Agreement established REDD+ as a critical and prominent piece of the new global climate goal to achieve net zero emissions in the second half of this century. In line with the principles of national sovereignty and subsidiarity, the UNFCCC primarily provides guidelines for REDD+ implementation and leaves it up to developing countries to decide on specific policies and activities they will undertake to improve their forest management and conserve forests. However, a number of elements were agreed upon for REDD+ as follows. The first element is a national strategy or action plan. Countries that want to implement REDD+ must establish a REDD+ national strategy or action plan to reduce their net greenhouse emissions from their forests. They are expected to make an assessment of the drivers of forest destruction and to base their REDD+ policies and measures on this assessment. The second element is the reference level. Countries must establish a reference level for their forest emissions, following guidance provided by the UNFCCC. The reference level provides a baseline that can be used to quantitatively assess the performance of their REDD+ strategy. Reference levels are based on a study of historical emissions and may be adjusted to reflect national circumstances. For example, a country may have a low level of historical emissions and have a high level of forest cover, but might anticipate that because of population growth, economic expansion, and other factors that its emissions could go up in the future. It might then adjust its reference level to account for these factors. Reference levels are very important as they provide the basis for assessing the effectiveness of REDD+ activities. For this reason, developing countries must submit their reference levels to the UNFCCC Secretariat, which arranges an expert review of the levels to assess their credibility. The third element is a national forest monitoring system. Developing countries are required to develop a robust and transparent national forest monitoring system that can report on their forest emissions. They report their forest emissions to the UNFCCC through what are known as biennial update reports. The UNFCCC Secretariat arranges a technical review of each report. Lastly, the fourth element is a safeguards information systems. Developing countries are required to establish a system for providing information on how they are recognizing and respecting the UNFCCC REDD+ safeguards. These elements reveal a number of important aspects of the thinking behind REDD+. First, there is an understanding that without national commitment, REDD+ will not be successful at the scale required for it to make a significant contribution to climate change mitigation. Because deforestation and forest degradation have proved to be such difficult problems to address. This is why the UNFCCC requires a national strategy for REDD+ and the reporting of performance at the national level. It is recognized that if REDD+ merely takes the form of a number of scattered projects around the world, it will not generate significant results. Second, a lot of attention is given to quantifying the effects of the REDD+ strategy. This is the purpose of the reference level and the National Forest Monitoring System. As with mitigation activities in other sectors, The unit used to quantify forest emissions and removals is tons of CO2 equivalent. This focus on quantification of effects is important because developing and developed countries could use REDD+ to achieve their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. NDCs are the targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that countries set themselves. To understand whether these targets are being achieved or not, national emissions must be monitored, and this includes emissions from forests. A question here is, why would developed countries be interested in using REDD+ for offsetting to achieve their NDCs? The reason is that REDD+ is considered to be a relatively low-cost emissions reduction option, compared to the options that developed countries have available to them. For example, a developed country may already be using fuel-efficient vehicles and may already have introduced wind turbines to generate clean energy and so forth, and many of their remaining options to reduce emissions may be costly. In this case, with the same amount of money spent on reducing emissions in its own territory, a developed country could support the reduction of a much larger volume of emissions in developing countries by financing REDD+. Another reason why REDD+ is a popular concept is that if REDD+ can stop deforestation and forest degradation, it will conserve biodiversity and protect important ecosystem services that forests provide, such as watershed protection. REDD+ could thus provide many unique co-benefits. However, concerns were raised that REDD+ could also have some negative outcomes if the only aim of forest management is to protect and enhance their carbon stocks. For example, governments might decide that rather than giving local communities a chance to manage forests, they will manage the forests themselves to generate large revenues from REDD+. Or, governments might decide to convert natural forests that don't have such high carbon stocks to fast-growing tree plantations that have higher carbon stocks. In the process, important biodiversity could be lost. Recognizing these and other risks, parties to the UNFCCC agreed on a set of 7 safeguards for REDD+. They also agreed that developing countries interested in implementing REDD+ must set up safeguards information systems to report on how they are respecting and addressing the safeguards. The 7 safeguards are that actions complement or are consistent with the objectives of national forest programs and relevant international conventions and agreements, transparent and effective national forest governance structures, taking into account national legislation and sovereignty, respect for the knowledge and rights of indigenous peoples and members of local communities by taking into account relevant international obligations, national circumstances and laws, and noting that the United Nations General Assembly has adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The full and effective participation of relevant stakeholders, in particular indigenous peoples and local communities. That actions are consistent with the conservation of natural forests and biological diversity. Ensuring that the actions are not used for the conversion of natural forests, but are instead used to incentivize the protection and conservation of natural forests and their ecosystem services, and to enhance other social and environmental benefits. Actions to address the risks of reversals, and actions to reduce displacement of emissions. Safeguard 6 on reversals refers to taking actions to reduce risks such as forest fires, which could mean that the carbon stocks that have been protected by REDD+ are suddenly lost to the atmosphere. Safeguard 7 on displacement refers to actions to reduce the risk of deforestation or degradation being displaced from one forest to another because of REDD+ activities. This might happen if REDD+ protects a forest in one area from conversion for agriculture, and because of this, the people who would have converted the forest move to another area to clear the forests there. Take a break quiz. Please read the following questions and choose O or X. Two, case studies. 2 case studies are provided below to illustrate preparations for and implementation of REDD+. The first case study describes the development of the national REDD+ framework in Indonesia. The second case study looks at how REDD+ is being implemented through the Rimba Raya Biodiversity Reserve REDD project. Indonesia has shown its commitment to REDD+ at high political levels since it hosted the 13th UNFCCC COP in 2007 in Bali. In 2009, then-President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono pledged a voluntary national CO2 emission reduction target of 26% by 2020 relative to the year 2000, and a 41% target with additional international financial support. Indonesia's first NDC submitted to the UNFCCC at COP22 indicates that REDD+ is an important part of the government's strategy to achieve the NDC emission reduction target. Indonesia has a total forested area of approximately 92.4 million hectares, equivalent to approximately 48% of its territory. However, these rich resources are disappearing rapidly. The forest reference level that Indonesia submitted to the UNFCCC shows that the average annual rate of deforestation in the period of 1990 to 2012 was 918,678 hectares. The main proximate causes of deforestation identified by the government are fire, illegal logging, and expansion of industrial timber plantations and palm oil plantations into forested areas. Developing and implementing a successful national REDD+ strategy is recognized as a massive undertaking, as past efforts to reduce deforestation have been mostly unsuccessful. Recognizing the challenges, the Ministry of Environment and Forests established the Directorate General on Climate Change in 2015 to report to the UNFCCC on REDD+, as well as coordinate and control the implementation of REDD+ activities. The National REDD+ strategy was developed in 2012. It has 4 goals: reducing greenhouse gas emissions, increasing carbon stocks, protecting biodiversity, and increasing the sustainability of the economic functions of forests. To achieve these goals, the strategy builds on 5 pillars: development of a REDD+ institutional system, review and strengthening of policies and regulations, launching of strategic programs, changes to the work paradigm and culture, and inclusion or involvement of stakeholders. These pillars reveal that the government understands that fundamental strengthening of government organizations and policies and regulations, as well as changes in attitude, are required for REDD+ to be successful in Indonesia. The fifth pillar, inclusion and involvement of stakeholders, is particularly important as here the government is acknowledging that REDD+ will only work if all major forest stakeholders are given the opportunity to provide inputs into the REDD+ strategy and to implement REDD+ activities. Over several decades, the government has learned that it cannot stop deforestation without all stakeholders having a chance to participate in and benefit from forest management. The actual activities that are planned by the government to protect and increase forest carbon stocks include improving the management of protected areas, controlling the conversion of peatlands, restoring peatlands and forests, improving the productivity of agricultural land and timber plantations in order to reduce pressure on natural forests, improving the practices of logging operation in natural forest, and reducing fires, amongst others. For the purposes of its forest reference level, the government developed a new definition of forests, which is a land area of more than 6.25 hectare with trees higher than 5 meters at maturity and a canopy cover of more than 30%. This definition is important because forests with these parameters can easily be mapped, both in the present and the recent past, with satellite imagery. And as some other definitions of forest in Indonesia include land that has been designated as forest land but actually has no trees on it. Indonesia's reference level only covers the REDD activity of reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, including emissions that occur from the decomposition of peat after it has been drained. To establish the reference level, land cover maps were created for the entire country for 8 years between 2012 using satellite imagery. Based on historical emissions from 1990 to 2012, the emissions from deforestation, forest degradation, and from peat decomposition are projected to be 593 metric tons of CO2 equivalent in 2020. The National Forest Monitoring System developed for REDD+ consists of a land cover mapping system and a national forest inventory. The land cover maps are created by processing Landsat images, which are now freely available. The National Forest Inventory is conducted using over 3,000 measurement plots established in forests across the country. Measurements of trees and other vegetation are taken in each plot, from which carbon stocks in each forest class can be estimated. With the information from the maps that show the area of each land use class and information on carbon stocks in each land use class, it is possible to estimate the volume of emissions when a certain area of forest is converted to another land use. With this information, the effects of REDD+ activities can be estimated. The government has developed national REDD+ safeguard standards that reflect the 7 UNFCCC REDD+ safeguards. The safeguards were developed through a multi-stakeholder process. Thus, all forest stakeholders were given the opportunity to help design the REDD+ safeguards. Indonesia's REDD+ safeguards make use of its existing instruments related to safeguards, such as its systems for environmental impact assessment, for certifying forest management, and for licensing legal timber harvesting. To implement the safeguards, the government requires REDD+ implementers to fill in a checklist, and it will then compile and provide this information to the UNFCCC. The government is developing a web-based system for the Safeguards Information System that is required for reporting to the UNFCCC. Let's look at the second case, the Rimba Raya project. Tropical peat swamp forest covers much of the southern coast of Borneo in the province of Central Kalimantan, Indonesia. In one area near the Tanjung Puting National Park, the local government issued 4 licenses for oil palm plantations in 2004. With these licenses, the companies would first harvest the valuable commercial tree species from the forest, then burn the remaining vegetation, and then systematically drain the peat soils. Later, scientists showed that this area is high in carbon stocks and biodiversity. Another concern was that if the forests were cleared from this area, then people might begin illegally clearing or using forests in the Tanjung Puting National Park. Yet another concern was that communities living in the area would no longer have forests where they could hunt, gather fuel wood, and obtain timber to construct their houses. One organization, Infinite Earth, recognized these problems and started to search for a solution. The strategy it came up with was to secure tenure for the area, meaning that the oil palm companies would no longer have the rights to clear the forest and develop the land. It was able to convince some of the oil palm companies to give up their tenure rights, and it was then able to secure a new type of license known as an ecosystem restoration concession, which gives it exclusive rights to manage the project area. Ecosystem restoration concessions, ERCs, are a new and innovative approach to forest management in Indonesia. It requires the rights holder to restore the existing forest and in return gives it the right to sell ecosystem services, including carbon sequestration and storage, generated by the forest, rather than giving the concession holder the rights to harvest timber from the forest. The government introduced the idea of ERCs because Indonesia has millions of hectares of degraded forests that were heavily logged in the past that it now wants to restore. In addition to securing tenure to the area, Infinite Earth's strategy to protect the peat swamp forest includes setting up forest patrols to stop illegal logging, creating a fire response system, and re-wetting the peat to reduce fire risks from damming the canals constructed by past logging operations. Planting indigenous and other appropriate species to restore the forest, and supporting the local communities to implement agroforestry in order to reduce pressure on the forest. In addition to these activities to address the causes of deforestation, other activities that were considered important to the area were included in the project design. These include funding conservation activities, such as rescuing orangutans orphaned by deforestation, rehabilitating them, and releasing them back into the wild. Providing materials and training for early childhood education programs. Supporting community food security through agriculture on land already under cultivation. Aquaculture and aquaponic initiatives, and improving the water supply by training communities to make inexpensive ceramic water filtration devices. Various voluntary carbon schemes exist that can be used to generate tradable carbon offsets, including offsets from REDD+. Infinite Earth decided to participate in one of these, the Verified Carbon Standard. It developed a methodology for estimating the effects of REDD+ in the project area. This methodology was approved by the VCS. To develop the reference level, Infinite Earth used satellite imagery and 28 sampling plots that it set up in the forest and it measured peat depth at 131 locations. It also used satellite imagery to monitor the forests during the implementation of the REDD+ activities. It reported the results of the monitoring to the VCS. Based on its assessment of the reports, by February 2016, VCS had issued the project with over 9 million verified REDD+ offsets that it could sell to fund its activities. For the REDD+ safeguards, Infinite Earth turned to another voluntary scheme that supports REDD+ projects, the Climate, Community, and Biodiversity Alliance. As the title of this scheme suggests, the Climate, Community, and Biodiversity Alliance provides guidance and verification for REDD+ projects, not only on climate, but also on community and biodiversity benefits. The scheme verified that the Rimba Raya project had both exceptional community and biodiversity benefits. This was because the project had been developed through close consultation with local communities to ensure it reflected their needs, and because it had made biodiversity conservation one of its main objectives. The project is clearly multi-purpose and not just aiming to protect and enhance forest carbon stocks. Take a break quiz. Please read the following questions and choose O or X. Three. Lessons learned. The development of REDD+ under the UNFCCC and the examples of how the government in Indonesia is developing its national REDD+ system and how REDD+ is being implemented through the Rimba Raya project offer a number of important lessons. The first lesson is that when tackling a deeply entrenched environmental problem, such as global deforestation, processes should be established that allow all the major stakeholders to participate in the development and implementation of the solution. In the negotiations under the UNFCCC, the concept began with REDD, but expanded to REDD+ because it was recognized that this would allow more countries to be part of the solution. Some countries don't have high rates of deforestation or degradation, but the conservation of their existing forest carbon stocks is important, and they may have the potential to increase these stocks. Broadening the scope of the solution from REDD to REDD+ allowed more countries to participate and gave the concept strong momentum, which ultimately led to the inclusion of REDD+ as one of the key instruments of the Paris Agreement. Stakeholder participation was also encouraged by providing opportunities for non-state organizations to contribute inputs to the negotiations. This was important, as concerns had been raised by indigenous peoples and others that REDD+ could harm their interests. The adoption of the 7 REDD+ safeguards was an outcome of this effort to engage non-state organizations, and because of these safeguards, many more organizations felt that REDD+ was worth supporting. Wide stakeholder participation can also be seen in the development of the REDD+ strategy in Indonesia. The government was aware that without strong stakeholder support, REDD+ could not take off in Indonesia. It therefore provided the public with opportunities to submit their views on what should be in the strategy. In the Rimba Raya project, we can also see that efforts were made by the project developers to engage with all the key stakeholders from the project design phase, especially the local communities and the local government. Because of this engagement, by June 2017, 9 of the communities adjacent to the project site had signed agreements stating that they agreed to preserve and restore the forest. REDD+ sets out to tackle an intractable global environmental problem, deforestation. Many initiatives and instruments with the same objective have preceded REDD+, but there is no strong evidence to indicate that collectively they have been able to bring down global deforestation rates. REDD+ is stepping into an arena in which there are powerful forces opposing it. Companies want to convert forests for oil palm and other agricultural commodities. Populations are expanding, and people are looking at forests as places where they can establish small agricultural holdings to raise their families and so on. It is clear that there are no simple solutions to global deforestation, and that any new instruments that take up this challenge not only have to be innovative, they also require supporters who will not give up when difficult challenges are faced. Within the UNFCCC negotiations, REDD+ took about a decade to flesh out. Indonesia's national REDD+ strategy took several years to develop. It also took the Rimba Raya project several years before it generated its first carbon offsets. In all of these cases, unforeseen obstacles arose. In the negotiations, a major issue of contention that took a long time to work around was whether funding of REDD+ through carbon markets should be allowed. In Indonesia, a difficult challenge was establishing the national organizational framework for REDD+, with conflict between different ministries over their role in REDD+ becoming a particularly sore point. For Rimba Raya, an unforeseen challenge was a long delay in securing an ecosystem restoration concession license because of outstanding overlapping claims to parts of the project area by some palm oil companies. In all of these cases, ways were found around the obstacles by people who believed in the concept and were willing to fight for it. Every year, the world is losing about 7 million hectares of primary forest, and it will be impossible to keep climate change below dangerous levels unless this rate is brought down. We have to act, and REDD+ is giving us a new option we can act on. But are all the pieces of REDD+ in place? No, they are not. Perhaps the most important piece is missing, and that is payments. For REDD+ to be implemented at a large scale, there must be a huge amount of financing to make it attractive for developing countries to keep their forests as forests. It is widely assumed that this financing will come from strong global demand for REDD+ offsets, demand that can only be generated by developed countries setting targets for deep emission cuts in their NDCs. Whether such demand will be generated is yet to be seen. The proponents of REDD+ recognize that given the seriousness of climate change, even in the face of uncertainty about payments, REDD+ had to be created as a new instrument for climate change mitigation. Through their efforts, REDD+ is part of the global architecture to mitigate climate change. Attention can now be placed on the last missing piece, payments. Summary. Let's review and summarize what we've learned so far. We learned about RED Plus this time. We will learn about low-carbon urban transformation of Yokohama next time. Goodbye.